Good to see you again.
Good to see you too.
I am also a member of a congressionally mandated commission called the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission. I'm bringing that up because in this building earlier this year, we had a hearing on supply chains. And in our annual report published last month, there is a section on supply chains. So if you're looking for more material concerning both the Chinese side of supply chains and the U.S. policy side, I would send you to the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission, it's a long title, website, and you will find some facts both in our report and in our hearing, which brought in witnesses who are experts on supply chains. Having said that, my remarks are my own. I do not speak for the Commission. Our report was consensus, and while I would really love to now talk as if I speak for the entire Commission, my colleagues would not appreciate that. My overview here, I'm on a China Commission, I'm going to be talking a lot about China. My overview here for the world supply chain is as my colleague on the panel just said, the current supply chain organization where we minimize costs and not coincidentally maximize stock prices is based on a global economy that will not exist for the indefinite future. It doesn't exist now, and it will not exist indefinitely. And the primary reason that is the case is that China under Xi Jinping is not a reliable partner now and will not be a reliable partner indefinitely. And I'll try to indicate not just the short term, but also the long term. And I will start, in fact, with the long term. I presume at this point that the long-standing debate over whether there is ongoing market reform in China is over. Actual reform, whether it's over or not, actual reform stopped no later than 13 years ago, 2009, probably more like 2005. Current policy in China is to discourage competition and instead create large firms under the control of the party. It is to some extent also not only anti-competitive, it is anti-innovative. China, of course, can be innovative. The claim that China can't innovate is false. And to some extent, it wants to be innovative, but only when that innovation is directed and shaped by the state. When a private firm becomes too successful, it becomes targeted by state action. We saw that start in 2019, it is continuing to now with an expected $1 billion fine levied at Ant Financial. You should be innovative, you should be successful up to a point. When you threaten state prerogatives, now you should stop being innovative and not be successful. That, of course, caps China's innovation capability and caps its attractiveness as a partner. The congressman was talking about labor force issues in the United States, which are very serious and very important in supply chains. And if you were to read U.S. government supply chain reports issued in February of this year, you're going to see the labor force as a theme. China's labor force problems are going to be much worse. They aren't worse yet, but they will be. China is aging extremely rapidly by demographic standards. In as little as 15 years, the aging and shrinking of the population could render China unrecognizable as an economic partner. That doesn't matter to current supply chains. But when someone comes to you and say, we want to build a new supply chain to China, and you're looking a decade or more down the road for its value, the Chinese will not be able to provide the same quality of production that they do now. Period. How far it falls is the only question. The debate over Chinese demographics is how fast, how hard the decline occurs. And we can go into that if there's time for Q&A. Finally, just came out yesterday, so very timely, the Bank of International Settlements compares leveraging across economies. It's a debt measure, but it's not the only debt measure, so I hate to call it debt. It is a measurement of debt to GDP. At the end of the second quarter of this year, China set a record for its own level of leveraging. Its debt was measured by the Bank of International Settlements as 295% of its GDP. That number has, it's a record, the number soared, and now it's sort of growing slowly. Nonetheless, they will exceed 300% of GDP, very likely, by the end of this year. This is 30 points worse than the United States. The United States is about 265. As someone who spends a lot of time talking to members of Congress and when I can, members of the administration, I think U.S. debt performance is terrible. I don't know what your perspective is, but I've always thought why you run up debt during a crisis. When you run up debt and there's no crisis, you're doing something fundamentally wrong. Well, the Chinese are worse than us. And in 2007, they were much better. The decline in Chinese debt performance is all the last 15 years. Again, the trend there is for China to become a heavily indebted country which lacks mobilizable capital resources due to their debt problem. That's not where they are now, just like that's not where they are on labor. It's where they're headed. So let's talk a little bit about China in the short term. I would say there is increasing evidence that growth is no longer China's priority economically. Instead, under General Secretary Xi Jinping, you get talk of common prosperity, which is about inequality. More relevant for our current discussion, you have talk of dual circulation. Now, these slogans can mean anything they want, and their meaning, in fact, changes over time. When dual circulation was first mentioned, it doesn't mean the same thing it does now. It will not mean the same thing 3 or 4 years from now. But Xi has started to say in 2018 that China should become less dependent on others. And there's a history there that you may know involving U.S. technological actions, among others. In 2020, he went a step further and started to say that China should make the world more dependent on China. That is a pretty rough combination if you're looking at China as a supply chain partner. We want to be less dependent on you. We want you to be more dependent on us. That is not the win-win story you hear from corporations when they say, don't interrupt the global supply chain. Plenty of private actors are aware of this. They don't care. They're looking for, as my colleague said, their stock price to go up for the next few years. However, it is not reasonable national policy to ignore when your major partner or one of your major partners says it wants to minimize your contribution to its economy and it wants to maximize its leverage over you. There are people who set aside what Xi Jinping says. That is a bad idea. He absolutely means what he says. This is absolutely a goal for China. Is he always successful? No. So he could fail. But if you have companies in the United States, around the world, advisors to you in whatever position you're in saying, oh, they don't really mean that. Yes, they do. And I can cite you the speeches made to the party repeatedly showing that they mean it. They may fail, but they mean it. They want a supply chain structure that makes you dependent on China and China not dependent on you for the sake of one-way economic coercion. So I would tell everyone in this room to prepare yourselves. In the long term, China will become a less valuable partner because of its mismanagement of both its population and its economy. In the short term, China is saying, well, while we've got these advantages, and they have them, let's use them to gain leverage over our supposed friends. We are not preparing very quickly for this in the United States. I would say we've had several administrations talk about supply chains as being important, not act. The Biden administration, it was a good first step. Can't fault them for that. Engaged a number of U.S. agencies, Department of Defense, Health and Human Services, Department of Energy, Department of Commerce, and so on, in studying supply chains. But their main conclusion was, wow, we really don't know a lot of stuff about supply chains. And since then, there has been very little U.S. action. Congress is talking about supply chains. There was a bill, not a perfect bill, certainly. I can see it not passing. There was a bill concerning supply chains that passed the House and was introduced in the Senate, not in that order, but it didn't pass. So we're still at the stage of talking. I would encourage everyone here to move past that stage. My colleague has already discussed, I'll just say quickly about, I agree with his points about chips. If you spend resources on final production because what you really want is a factory you can smash a champagne bottle over and workers hired, that's great, you may not escape dependence. You actually might increase your dependence on the suppliers of inputs to that final production. So when we build a chip plant here, where does the final result go for testing and packaging? China is a major player in testing and packaging. Where do the inputs necessary for the chip plant come from? That was not properly addressed in the bill. So the bill appears to be an effort to make America more independent, but it does not do so. Pharmaceuticals are the thing I worry about the most. If you are a pharmaceutical importer, you may be importing directly from China, or you may be importing from a country that depends on China for the chemical inputs to their pharmaceuticals. If you are a pharmaceutical exporter, Are you independent of the Chinese in the supply chain? That's unlikely. China accounts for the majority of the world's fine chemical production. If you are making pharmaceuticals, you are probably using Chinese chemical inputs. If you are buying pharmaceuticals, your supply chain, you may think that your partner is India, but ultimately it's also China. And that's the kind of action that implies the kind of action we need to take. When you try to make, if the emphasis is on final manufacturing occurring in a country, that does not address your supply chain problem. That may address unemployment problems, economic growth problems. It does not address your supply chain problem. My recommendation I've made in my personal capacity, the Commission has adopted to some extent, and I would make to all of you, is that the days of lack of supply chain transparency should come to as quick an end as possible. In other words, if you know your tier 1 supplier and you have no idea who they're dealing with, or you have some idea who they're dealing with, but there's a tier 4 supplier, a tier 5 supplier, and you don't know who they are, that's got to stop. And that is not an anti-market measure. That is a pro-market measure. Companies that tell you you're interfering with the proper functioning of markets by providing information are lying. Markets rely on proper information. You're interfering with their profitability and their stock prices, maybe. You're not interfering with the proper functioning of markets. So that is a recommendation I would make to everyone here. There is no legitimate argument against knowing what your supply chain looks like. I can't say, as an indirect representative of the United States government, not direct as the congressman was, but employed by the Congress, that we're doing a good job. So it's a little bit of hypocrisy from the podium here, but it would be great if everyone did a better job. To wrap up, I will talk a little bit about the global adjustment involved. We're going to have supply chains move out of China. They will either do it very slowly as China ages and shrinks, population-wise and eventually economically. They could do it as a function of policy where we're smart about it and we say, what are the supply chains that are fine to be in China? What are the supply chains we're not comfortable to be in China? What actions can we take? Or it can be done suddenly in the case of a conflict, for example, over Taiwan. That last part is the disaster. You're not making a choice by putting this off. Rather, you are making a choice by seeming to put off your choice. If you say, I don't want to deal with a supply chain issue, it's complicated and costly. It is. You're right. But it can be decided for you. A U.S.-China conflict over Taiwan would affect, obviously, the U.S. and China. It would affect all the other countries in East Asia on the supply chain. It would affect a number of countries around the world that rely on U.S. Demand, which would be impacted, and so on. So there are supply chain choices that are going to be made regardless of whether countries are willing to make them. Over time, trans-Pacific supply chains will shrink. The countries involved should be prepared. There is no way to avoid this. Again, China is going to matter less economically. And I think I'm gonna stop with this point. If countries choose to do this suddenly in Taiwan, it's a blow to the whole world economy. If they do it slowly, they're opening an opportunity for China, as Xi Jinping has said, to exert coercion over them. If you do it by policy, the cost minimization model is going to end. What we're saying here is we don't want supply chains that are just based on minimizing costs. And I can't answer the following question, but as for those of you who are politicians, you're going to need to have to propose something else to your people, right? We have sold a story of everything's lower cost, good for companies, their stock prices go up, good for consumers. If you're going to replace that, and my point here is it's going to end. It's going to end slowly, it's going to end quickly, and suddenly it's going to end. We need a new organizing principle for supply chains. And so in addition to a technical challenge, which I've discussed a little bit here, there is a political challenge to say who our partners are going to be and why we're going to trade in the way we do when it means some things are going to be more expensive. Thank you.